The cruelest part of betrayal is not when they leave you, but when they smile because they believe they have already won. Caleb Whitmore sat alone on the left side of the county courtroom, his shoulders squared inside a charcoal gray suit that had been pressed that morning with the care of a man who refused to look broken in public. In his left hand, hidden beneath the edge of the table, he held his wedding ring between his thumb and forefinger. The gold felt colder than it should have, heavier than it had ever felt during 10 years of marriage. In front of him rested a black folder, plain, unmarked, and closed. Anyone looking at Caleb would have seen a quiet husband facing the end of his marriage. No one would have guessed that inside that folder were the pieces of a story Madison Whitmore and Ryan Keller had never expected anyone to put together. The courtroom smelled faintly of old paper, floor polish, and rain-soaked wool from the people who had stepped in from the wet parking lot outside. A clock above the judge's bench ticked with a steady, indifferent rhythm. Caleb watched the second hand move and reminded himself not to look toward the door. He had promised Rebecca Hayes, his attorney, that he would not react. Not to Madison, not to Ryan, not to whatever performance they had rehearsed for this morning. Then the door opened. Conversation died down in small pieces, like someone lowering the volume on the room. Madison walked in first, wearing a cream-colored dress and a light coat that looked too elegant for a divorce hearing. Her blonde hair was styled in soft waves, her makeup carefully done, her face composed in that polished way she used whenever she wanted strangers to believe she was calm, reasonable, and wounded. But she was not alone. Ryan Keller walked beside her with one hand resting at the small of her back, guiding her as if the courtroom belonged to him. He was tall, clean-shaven, and dressed in a navy suit that looked expensive from a distance, the kind of man who knew how to enter a room and make people look before they realized they were looking. Madison leaned toward him, and he whispered something near her ear. She laughed. It was not loud, but Caleb heard it clearly. That was what cut deeper than the papers, deeper than the lies in the divorce petition, deeper than the months of silence at home. She laughed in the same room where their marriage was about to be taken apart under oath. Ryan looked across the aisle and found Caleb's face. His mouth curved just enough to make the message clear. Then, as Madison adjusted the strap of her purse, Ryan leaned closer and said in a voice meant to be private but not quiet enough, "Enjoy your last day in that house." Caleb did not answer. He did not tighten his jaw. He did not stand. He simply placed the wedding ring on the table beside the black folder and covered it with his palm. Madison saw the movement and mistook it for weakness. Her eyes softened into something almost like pity, though there was no kindness in it. She turned away, sat beside her attorney, and let Ryan take the seat directly behind her, close enough to look like support, close enough to remind Caleb that he had been replaced. Across the room, Rebecca Hayes glanced at Caleb once, a silent warning and reassurance at the same time. Wait, let them speak first. Let them laugh first. Let them believe the morning belonged to them. Caleb lowered his eyes to the folder. He thought about the house Ryan had just mentioned, the house Caleb had rebuilt board by board after work, the house Madison now claimed she deserved because she said he had made her feel trapped there. He thought about the savings account, the credit card charges, the consulting invoices, the watch on Ryan's wrist, and the photograph Madison had posted with the caption "New Life." No regrets. His breathing stayed even. His hand stayed still. At the front of the room, the bailiff called everyone to rise, and Judge Eleanor Brooks entered with a stack of files in her arms. Madison lifted her chin as if she were ready to be believed. Ryan settled back with the relaxed confidence of a man waiting to watch another man lose. Caleb stood with everyone else, but his eyes never left the judge's bench. For the first time in months, he was not afraid of what Madison might say. He was waiting for the moment when the room would finally hear what she had tried so hard to hide. Caleb had not always been the man sitting alone in a courtroom with a black folder and a wedding ring under his palm. 10 years earlier, he had been a 28-year-old project manager with calluses on his hands from weekend repair jobs and a habit of believing that love meant showing up even when no one applauded you for it. He met Madison at a small coffee shop outside Portland on a rainy Thursday morning when she dropped a stack of design samples near the pickup counter. Paper swatches scattered across the floor, and while other people stepped around them, Caleb knelt down and helped her gather every piece. She had laughed then too, but it had been different. Nervous, warm, real. She told him she was trying to start an interior design business with more ambition than money, and Caleb listened as if her dream already mattered to him. Within a year, they were married in a modest ceremony behind a white church with 60 guests, paper lanterns, and a rented sound system that kept cutting out during their first dance. They did not have much, but Caleb remembered feeling rich when Madison rested her head on his shoulder and whispered that she finally felt safe. Safe became the word he built his life around. When Madison's student loans came due, Caleb picked up weekend consulting jobs. When her first office lease required a deposit she did not have, he sold the old Mustang his father had left him, smiling through the ache because Madison cried when he handed her the check. When the little house on Alder Street needed a new roof, Caleb spent 3 Saturdays learning how to do half the work himself just to save labor costs. He was not flashy. He did not make grand speeches. He fixed leaky faucets, packed her lunch when she worked late, drove across town to bring fabric samples she had forgotten, and sat beside her through every disappointment that came with building something from nothing. In those early years, Madison looked at him like he was the one person the world had given her on purpose. But success changed the lighting around her, and slowly, Caleb began to see shadows he had ignored. The business grew. Her clients became wealthier. Her dinners ran later. Her phone, once left carelessly on the kitchen counter, started traveling with her from room to room. She replaced their framed honeymoon photo in the hallway with a large abstract painting one of her clients had praised. She stopped asking Caleb what he thought before making decisions, then began acting irritated when he answered. At first, Caleb told himself she was tired. Then he told himself she was stressed. Then he told himself that every marriage had seasons where two people moved through the same house, like strangers waiting for the weather to change. But Madison was not waiting for the weather to change. She was changing the story. The man who had helped her survive the hard years became, in her words, a reminder of limitation. The house he had repaired became a cage. The careful budgeting that had kept them afloat became control. One night, when Caleb suggested they take a quiet weekend at the Oregon coast and leave their phones off, Madison looked at him with a sadness that felt rehearsed and said, "You still think small, Caleb. That is the problem." He remembered standing there in the kitchen, the refrigerator humming behind him, trying to understand when loving her steadily had become something she could resent. By the time Ryan Keller entered her life, Madison had already made room for someone who could tell her that her restlessness was courage, that her guilt was growth, and that Caleb was not the man who had carried her through the storm, but the weight keeping her from flying. Ryan Keller did not arrive in Madison's life like a storm. He arrived like an invitation. The first time Caleb heard his name, Madison mentioned him over dinner as if he were just another client, a commercial real estate consultant who needed design work for a high-end office space downtown. She said he was demanding but brilliant. Then, a few days later, she said he was difficult but inspiring. A week after that, she said Ryan understood ambition in a way most people did not. Caleb noticed the shift before he wanted to admit it. Madison began dressing differently for meetings with him, choosing heels she rarely wore and perfume she used to save for anniversaries. She started coming home with stories that always seemed to include Ryan standing near the center of the room, saying the clever thing, knowing the important person, opening the right door. To Caleb, Ryan looked polished in the way a showroom looked polished, impressive until someone checked what was behind the walls. He drove a black leased Mercedes, wore tailored navy suits, and spoke with the confidence of a man who had learned that certainty could be mistaken for success. When Caleb finally met him at a charity fundraiser Madison had designed, Ryan shook his hand with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Caleb, right? Madison has told me a lot about you," he said, stretching the word "lot" just enough to make Caleb wonder what version of him had been described. That night, Caleb watched Ryan move through the room like he owned every conversation. He complimented Madison in front of donors, called her vision exceptional, and made sure everyone heard it. Madison glowed under that attention. Caleb tried to be proud of her, but a quiet unease settled in his chest when Ryan placed a hand briefly on Madison's shoulder while introducing her to a developer from Seattle. It was not the gesture itself. It was the way Madison did not step away. After that, Ryan became a presence in their marriage without ever needing to enter their home. His name appeared in texts that made Madison smile at her phone. His opinions found their way into decisions about furniture, restaurants, business plans, even vacations Caleb had suggested first and Madison had dismissed. Ryan told her she was outgrowing her old life, and Madison repeated the phrase one evening while standing in their bedroom, as if it had come from her own heart. Caleb asked what that meant. She looked around the room, at the dresser they had bought secondhand, at the framed photo from their wedding, at the quilt his mother had made them, and said, "It means I am tired of pretending this is enough." Caleb felt something inside him go still. He did not accuse her. Not then. He still believed the woman he married was somewhere beneath the new clothes, the late nights, and the borrowed words. But Ryan understood exactly what Madison wanted to hear. He did not tell her to betray her husband. He told her she deserved more. He did not call Caleb weak. He called him safe, then made safe sound like a sentence. He did not ask Madison for money in the beginning. He asked for trust, sympathy, admiration, and small favors that looked harmless on paper. An introduction to a client, a shared expense for a business dinner, access to a joint credit card because the restaurant deposit needed to be handled quickly and he would reimburse it by Friday. Each request came wrapped in charm, and Madison, hungry to feel chosen by a man she believed was powerful, never saw the pattern forming. Caleb saw pieces of it, but not the whole picture yet. He only knew that his wife was drifting toward a man who smiled too easily, promised too much, and looked at people as if he were measuring what they could give him. By the time Madison stopped hiding how much Ryan mattered to her, Caleb had begun to understand the most painful truth of all. Ryan had not stolen Madison from him. He had simply offered her a mirror that made selfishness look like freedom, and Madison had chosen to keep looking. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday evening, placed in the center of the kitchen table like Madison wanted them to be the first thing Caleb saw when he walked through the door. He had spent the day managing a construction budget that had gone sideways, then stopped at a grocery store on the way home because Madison had once mentioned she missed the tomato basil soup from the little cafe near their first apartment. He came in carrying 2 paper bags, rain on his coat, and the kind of tired hope that still made him set the table for 2 even when dinner had been quiet for months. Madison was standing by the window with her arms crossed, watching the headlights move along Alder Street. She did not turn around when he set the bags down. Caleb looked at the envelope, saw the name of a law firm printed in clean black letters, and knew before he opened it. Still, knowing did not protect him from the words. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Request for exclusive use of the marital residence. Request for temporary spousal support. Request for division of assets. Every line felt less like a legal document and more like Madison had hired strangers to erase him from the life he had built with her. He read in silence while the soup cooled in the bag. Madison finally turned and said, "I did not want it to be ugly." Caleb looked up at her. She was wearing the pearl earrings he had bought her for their 7th anniversary, and for some reason, that hurt more than the papers. "Then why does this say I controlled you financially?" he asked. Madison lifted her chin, the same way she would later do in court. Because that is how it felt. Caleb stared at her, trying to find the woman who had once cried in his arms because he sold his father's Mustang to keep her dream alive. "I paid your loans because you asked me to. I helped with the business because you said you could not do it alone. I tracked our spending because we were trying to stay afloat." Madison's face tightened, not with guilt, but with irritation. "You always do that. You make it sound noble, like I should spend the rest of my life thanking you." The room went quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock above the stove. Caleb noticed the house around them in pieces. The cabinets he had refinished by hand, the floorboards he had sanded until midnight, the small crack in the window trim he had meant to fix before winter. Madison was asking for all of it now, not because she had built it, but because she wanted to leave with proof that she had won. "Is this because of Ryan?" Caleb asked. Madison did not deny it. She looked away for only a second, but the answer was already in the silence. Then she said, "Ryan makes me feel like I am not settling." Caleb felt the sentence land, clean and final. He had expected tears, maybe anger, maybe some version of regret. What he had not expected was the calm cruelty of a woman who had already practiced this conversation in her mind until he no longer sounded human in it. "And what am I supposed to be?" he asked. Madison stepped closer to the table, placed her fingertips on the divorce papers, and said, "You are part of a life I outgrew." Caleb nodded once, slowly, because if he spoke too quickly, something in his voice might break. He folded the papers back into the envelope. He did not beg. He did not raise his voice. He did not ask her to remember who had stood beside her when no one else believed in her. He only picked up the grocery bags, put the soup into the refrigerator, and washed his hands at the sink while Madison watched him as if his quietness disappointed her. Later that night, he slept in the guest room for the first time since they bought the house. Through the wall, he heard Madison talking softly on the phone. He could not make out every word, but he heard Ryan's name once, followed by a laugh that was too relieved to be innocent. Caleb lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling fan he had installed during their second summer there, and understood something that changed the shape of his grief. Madison did not simply want a divorce. She wanted a version of the story where Caleb became the reason she had to leave. She wanted the house, the money, the sympathy, and the freedom to call betrayal a brave new beginning. By morning, the rain had stopped. Madison was gone before breakfast, leaving behind only the faint scent of perfume and a copy of the petition on the kitchen table. Caleb stood over it for a long time. Then he took a folder from the drawer, slid the papers inside, and wrote one word on the tab in black ink: evidence. Caleb did not start looking for proof because he wanted revenge. He started because Madison's petition made him realize that silence would not protect him anymore. For 3 days after she filed, he moved through the house like a careful stranger, noticing things he had trained himself to overlook. The missing bank statements from the desk drawer. The locked laptop she used to leave open on the couch. The way Madison stepped outside to take calls, even when the Oregon rain came down hard enough to soak her coat. Then, late on a Friday night, the first crack appeared by accident. Caleb was sitting alone at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee gone cold when his phone lit up. Madison had posted a photo online. She and Ryan were seated at a rooftop restaurant downtown, the city lights behind them, 2 glasses of sparkling water on the table, Madison smiling like a woman already free. The caption read, "New life. No regrets." Caleb stared at the picture for a long moment, not because of her smile, and not because Ryan's hand rested possessively near her chair. It was the watch on Ryan's wrist. A silver Swiss watch with a dark blue face. The same watch Caleb remembered seeing on a credit card statement 2 weeks earlier, charged to the joint account Madison had claimed was only used for household expenses. The amount had been almost $4,000. Madison had told him it was a vendor deposit. Caleb enlarged the photo with 2 fingers and felt his sadness sharpen into something colder and clearer. The next morning, he drove 12 miles to a branch of their bank instead of logging in from home. He requested printed statements for the last 18 months, then sat in his truck in the parking lot while rain tapped against the windshield. Line by line, the pattern began to show itself. Restaurant charges on nights Madison said she had client meetings. Hotel conference rooms booked under vague business names. Transfers labeled consulting support. Payments to Keller Strategic Consulting, a company Caleb had never heard of until Ryan entered their lives. The amounts were not always large, and that made them more unsettling. $700 here, $1,200 there. A repeated monthly payment for $2,500 that had been described as design subcontracting. Caleb drove home with the statements in a manila envelope on the passenger seat. For the first time since the divorce papers arrived, he did not feel like he was drowning. He felt like he had found the edge of something buried. Over the next week, Caleb gathered what he could legally access: bank records, credit card statements, shared tax documents, invoices that had been emailed to their household account, and screenshots of public posts Madison had forgotten were visible. He found an invoice from Keller Strategic Consulting with a downtown address that belonged to a mailbox rental store. He found a contract with no client signature. He found a charge for a weekend at a resort on the Oregon coast, dated the same weekend Madison had told him she was attending a design workshop in Bend, more than 100 miles away. Each discovery hurt, but the hurt had a purpose now. He was not just reading proof of an affair. He was reading proof that Madison had been moving pieces of their marriage into Ryan's hands while preparing to tell a judge that Caleb was the one who had trapped her. When Caleb finally met Rebecca Hayes in her office, he placed the folder on her desk without drama. Rebecca was in her early 50s, sharp-eyed, calm, and known for listening longer than most attorneys before she spoke. She read for nearly 20 minutes while Caleb sat across from her, watching her expression change from professional focus to quiet concern. At last, She removed her glasses and tapped the invoice with the false address. "Caleb," she said, "this is not only about infidelity." He waited. Rebecca looked at the bank statements again. "There may be dissipation of marital assets here. Maybe fraud, depending on what we can verify. If Madison and Ryan used marital money under false pretenses, that matters." Caleb looked down at his hands. They were steady. "So what do we do?" Rebecca closed the folder and slid it back toward him. "We do not warn them. We do not argue with them. We document everything, and we let them walk into court believing you have nothing." Caleb left her office as the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, the black folder tucked under his arm. For months, Madison had mistaken his quiet for weakness. Ryan had mistaken his decency for stupidity. But Caleb was beginning to understand that sometimes the loudest answer was not a shout. Sometimes it was a paper trail, gathered one page at a time, waiting for the right room and the right judge. In the weeks before the hearing, Caleb learned the discipline of silence. It was harder than anger, harder than grief, harder than packing his clothes into the guest room while Madison moved through the house as if she had already inherited it. Rebecca Hayes had given him clear instructions. Do not confront her. Do not warn Ryan. Do not send emotional messages. Do not give them a reason to change their story. So Caleb became careful. When Madison came home late and left her keys on the counter with a restaurant valet tag still attached, he said nothing. When she stood in the living room and spoke loudly on the phone about how exhausting it was to be married to someone who could not celebrate her growth, he walked past her with a basket of laundry and kept his face unreadable. When envelopes from her attorney arrived, filled with statements that made him sound cold, controlling, and small, he scanned them, saved copies, and placed them in the black folder. Madison mistook his restraint for surrender. That was the first mistake. Ryan mistook it for fear. That was the second. Together, they became careless. Madison began leaving traces of confidence everywhere. She told a neighbor Caleb would probably move out after the first hearing. She ordered new furniture for the primary bedroom before any judge had ruled on the house. She changed the locks on her office downtown and told her assistant that Ryan would be handling more of her business strategy once the divorce was finalized. Caleb heard pieces of it through mutual acquaintances, forwarded emails, and the quiet way people stopped speaking when he walked into a room. None of it surprised him anymore. What surprised him was how calm he felt each time he added another page to the folder. The night before court, the house on Alder Street felt hollow. Madison had not come home for dinner. Caleb ate a turkey sandwich at the kitchen counter, standing beside the same sink where he had washed his hands after reading the divorce papers. Rain streaked the window above the faucet, turning the porch light into a blurred yellow circle. The black folder sat beside him, thicker now, held closed with a silver binder clip. Inside were bank records, invoices, photographs, messages Rebecca had legally obtained through discovery, and one short transcript that Caleb had read only once because once was enough. In it, Ryan described Madison not as a woman he loved, but as an opportunity. Caleb finished half the sandwich and threw the rest away. He was not nervous about losing Madison anymore. That part had already happened. He was nervous about sitting still while she lied under oath. Around 9 o'clock, his phone buzzed. A message from Madison appeared on the screen. "Try not to embarrass yourself tomorrow." For a moment, Caleb looked at those words and remembered the young woman at the coffee shop, kneeling beside him to pick up scattered design samples, smiling like life had just handed her a beginning. Then he looked around at the house she now wanted to take from him with a rewritten history and a stranger standing behind her. He did not reply. He took a screenshot, sent it to Rebecca, and placed the phone face down on the counter. The next morning, he woke before sunrise. He shaved, put on the charcoal gray suit, and tied his tie twice because the first knot looked crooked. In the mirror, he saw a tired man, but not a defeated one. At the courthouse, Rebecca met him near the entrance with a paper cup of coffee he barely touched. "Remember," she said, her voice low. "Let them perform." Caleb nodded. "And when they lie?" Rebecca adjusted the folder under her arm. "Then we answer with documents." That was how he ended up in the courtroom, standing as Judge Eleanor Brooks took the bench, while Madison sat across the aisle with Ryan behind her and a practiced sadness on her face. Her attorney began by describing a lonely wife, an emotionally distant husband, a marriage that had slowly become unbearable. Madison lowered her eyes at the right moments. Ryan leaned back as if enjoying a show. Caleb listened to his own life being turned inside out for strangers, and every false sentence landed against him like rain against glass. It touched the surface, but it did not get through. Because beneath his palm, beside the wedding ring, the black folder waited. Madison's attorney spoke for nearly 12 minutes, and every minute seemed designed to make Caleb disappear from his own life. He described Madison as a woman who had spent years trying to be heard. He said she had carried emotional loneliness behind the closed doors of a marriage that looked stable from the outside. He said Caleb had controlled the money, controlled the house, controlled the pace of their life, and left Madison with no choice but to seek independence. Madison sat with her hands folded in her lap, her cream-colored dress glowing softly beneath the courtroom lights. She lowered her eyes when her attorney mentioned pain. She pressed a tissue beneath one eye when he mentioned sacrifice. She looked, to anyone who did not know the history, like a woman who had finally found the courage to leave. Ryan sat behind her with one ankle resting over the other, his expression relaxed, almost entertained. Every so often, Madison tilted her head slightly, and Ryan gave her the smallest nod, like a coach approving a performance. Caleb watched without moving. He could feel Rebecca beside him taking notes, though she already knew which parts mattered. The false claim about the joint account. The statement that Madison had never used marital money for personal benefit. The suggestion that Ryan had no financial connection to the marriage and was present only as emotional support. That line made Caleb look down at the black folder. Emotional support. That was what they called a man whose company had received thousands of dollars from accounts Caleb had funded. That was what they called a man wearing a watch paid for with money Madison had described as a vendor deposit. When Madison was invited to speak, she stood slowly, as if the weight of the moment nearly overcame her. Her voice was quiet at first. She said Caleb was a good man in public, but distant at home. She said he did not understand her ambition. She said he made her feel guilty for wanting more. Then came the line Caleb knew she had practiced. "I only wanted to be free," Madison said, looking toward the judge instead of at him. "I wanted a chance to live a life where I did not have to apologize for becoming who I was meant to be." For the first time that morning, Caleb saw Judge Eleanor Brooks stop writing. The judge was a white-haired woman with calm eyes and the kind of presence that made the room feel smaller when she was silent. She looked at Madison for a moment, then turned one page in the file before her. Rebecca's pen paused. Ryan's smile remained, but it grew thinner. Judge Brooks adjusted her glasses and looked beyond Madison, toward the second row. "Mr. Ryan Keller," she said. The sound of his name changed the air. It was not loud. It did not need to be. Madison turned halfway in her chair, confused by the sudden attention. Ryan straightened, smoothing the front of his navy suit as he stood. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, still carrying the polished confidence he had worn into the room. Judge Brooks looked down at the document in front of her. "You are the owner or managing member of Keller Strategic Consulting, correct?" Ryan blinked once. "Yes, Your Honor. That is my consulting firm. And you are acquainted with Mrs. Whitmore through her design business?" "That is correct." His answer came quickly, but Caleb noticed his hand move to his cuff, adjusting it though nothing was wrong with it. Judge Brooks turned another page. "The court has received materials indicating that Keller Strategic Consulting accepted multiple payments from marital funds belonging to Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore. Some of those payments appear to have occurred during the period directly relevant to this proceeding." Madison's face changed before she could stop it. The sadness she had arranged so carefully slipped, replaced by surprise sharp enough for the entire room to see. Her attorney rose halfway from his chair. "Your Honor, we were not made aware that this would be addressed today." Rebecca stood smoothly. "Your Honor, these records were produced through appropriate discovery requests and are directly relevant to the requested division of assets, temporary support, and the allegation that my client financially controlled Mrs. Whitmore." Judge Brooks nodded once. "You may proceed, Ms. Hayes." Rebecca opened her copy of the black folder, and Caleb felt the moment arrive with no satisfaction, only a solemn steadiness. Ryan looked at Madison then, but not with reassurance. He looked at her the way a man looks at a locked door after hearing someone find the key. Rebecca's voice was clear, even, and impossible to ignore. "Mr. Keller, before this court accepts the claim that you have no financial interest in this divorce, we need to discuss the invoices your company sent to Madison Whitmore. the charges made to the joint account, and the payments that were categorized as business services while appearing to fund personal expenses. Ryan's mouth opened slightly, then closed. Behind him, the same people who had watched Madison walk in laughing now watched his confidence drain one careful inch at a time. Caleb did not turn toward Madison. He did not need to. He could feel her looking at him across the aisle, no longer with pity, no longer with triumph, but with the first terrible realization that the quiet man she had underestimated had not come to court empty-handed. Rebecca did not raise her voice. She did not have to. She placed the first statement on the evidence table and spoke with the calm precision of someone opening a locked room one key at a time. On March 12th, a payment of $2,500 was made from the Whitmore joint account to Keller Strategic Consulting. The invoice described the service as market positioning analysis. Can you explain what specific work was performed for that payment? Ryan adjusted his cuffs again. I would need to review my records. Rebecca nodded as if she expected that answer. Of course. On April 9th, another $2,500 was paid to the same company. On May 9th, again. On June 10th, again. For identical payments. All marked as consulting services, all drawn from marital funds. Madison turned toward her attorney, whispering something Caleb could not hear. Her attorney kept his eyes on the documents, and for the first time all morning, he looked less certain. Rebecca continued. We also have charges to the joint credit card for a restaurant deposit, a resort stay on the Oregon coast, and a luxury watch purchased 2 weeks before Mrs. Whitmore filed for divorce. Mr. Keller, are you wearing that watch today? The courtroom seemed to narrow around Ryan's left wrist. His hand dropped toward his side, but everyone had already looked. The silver watch with the dark blue face caught the courtroom light. Madison saw it too, and her expression shifted from confusion to something more painful. Recognition. Rebecca did not pause long enough for Ryan to recover. Mrs. Whitmore represented to my client that this purchase was a vendor deposit. The receipt tells a different story. Judge Brooks leaned forward slightly. Mr. Keller, answer the question. Ryan cleared his throat. It was a gift. Madison's head turned sharply. A gift. The word escaped before she could stop herself. Ryan looked at her then, and in that glance Caleb saw the relationship change. Until that moment, Ryan had played the role of protector, the man who had promised Madison a bigger life. Now he looked at her as if she were a problem standing too close to him. Rebecca opened another page. There is more. During discovery, we obtained messages from Mrs. Whitmore's business account after they were referenced in financial records. In one exchange, Mr. Keller wrote to a third party that Mrs. Whitmore was, and I quote, the easiest door into the Whitmore assets. Madison went still. Rebecca's voice remained steady. In another message, he wrote that once the house was awarded or sold, he would help turn the equity into usable cash. Ryan's attorney, who had not expected to be needed in a divorce hearing because Ryan had walked in only as supposed support, stood from the back row and asked for a pause to confer. Judge Brooks allowed him to approach, but the damage had already reached the room. Madison's hands were trembling around the tissue she had used earlier for performance. Now there was no performance left. She looked at Ryan as if she were waiting for him to deny it, to call it a misunderstanding, to offer one of the smooth explanations that had carried her out of her marriage. Ryan did not look back at her. He stared at the judge's bench. That told her everything. Rebecca then presented the mailbox address, the unsigned contracts, and the pattern of payments that followed private meetings between Madison and Ryan. She did not accuse more than the documents could support. She simply connected the dates, the amounts, the labels, and the lies Madison had told Caleb when he had asked about them. Each page made Madison smaller in her chair, not because she had been innocent, but because she was realizing she had not been the partner in Ryan's plan. She had been the path. Caleb watched quietly as the story Madison tried to sell began folding in on itself. She had wanted to come into court as a woman escaping a controlling husband. Instead, the records showed a wife moving marital money through a man who had privately mocked her and planned around her. Judge Brooks removed her glasses and looked first at Madison, then at Ryan. Given the financial questions raised here, this court will not proceed with any temporary award involving the disputed funds or residents today. I am ordering a review of the relevant accounts, invoices, and transfers. Mr. Keller, you may be required to provide business records connected to these payments. Ryan's face lost the last trace of confidence. Madison's eyes filled, but this time she did not look wounded for the room. She looked humiliated by the truth. She turned toward Caleb as if only now remembering that he was the one person who had warned her with his silence. But Caleb did not give her anger. He did not give her pity. He gave her nothing to hold on to. His hand rested beside the wedding ring, steady and open, while the courtroom sat in a silence that sounded like every life finally running out of air. Judge Brooks called a short recess, and for the first time that morning, no one moved with confidence except Caleb. Ryan remained near the back row with his attorney speaking quietly beside him, but the easy smile he had carried into the courtroom was gone. Madison sat frozen at the table, her cream-colored dress no longer looking elegant, only painfully bright under the lights. She had entered that room as if the ending had already been written in her favor. Now she looked like a woman who had read the last page and found out she was not the heroine of the story at all. Caleb gathered the black folder, slid the wedding ring into the pocket of his suit jacket, and stood without looking at either of them. Rebecca touched his arm lightly. "You did well," she said. Caleb gave a small nod, though he did not feel like a man who had won. Winning sounded too simple for what this was. This was the slow return of his own name, his own dignity, his own truth after months of being painted as the villain in a marriage he had tried to save. As he stepped into the hallway, the courthouse seemed quieter than before. People passed with files tucked under their arms, shoes tapping against polished floors, lives changing behind closed doors every few minutes. Caleb walked toward the tall windows at the end of the corridor where pale Oregon sunlight was finally pushing through the clouds. Behind him, he heard hurried footsteps. "Caleb." Madison's voice broke on his name. He stopped, but he did not turn right away. For 10 years, that voice had been home. Then it had become distance, then accusation. Now it sounded like fear. "Caleb, please," she said, coming closer. "I did not know what he was doing." He turned then. Her eyes were red, her hands still trembling, the tissue crushed between her fingers. For a second, he saw the woman from the coffee shop, the woman with scattered design samples and rain in her hair, the woman he had once believed he would grow old beside. But that woman was gone, or maybe she had simply become someone else while he was busy loving the memory of her. Caleb looked at Madison, not cruelly, not softly, but honestly. "No," he said. "You knew who you were betraying. You just did not know he was betraying you too." Madison lowered her eyes as if the sentence had taken the last defense from her. There was nothing left for Caleb to explain, nothing left to argue over in that hallway. The court would review the accounts. Ryan would have to answer for his business records. Madison would have to face the damage she had helped create. Caleb could not control any of that, and for the first time in months, he did not need to. He walked away before she could say his name again. Outside, the air smelled clean after the rain, and the courthouse steps were still damp beneath his shoes. Caleb paused halfway down, reached into his pocket, and took out the wedding ring. He held it in his palm one last time, not as a symbol of failure, but as proof that he had loved with both hands open. And when that love was used against him, he still did not become the kind of man who had to destroy someone to survive. He slipped the ring into a small envelope from the black folder and sealed it. Then he breathed in deeply, the way a person does when a locked room finally opens. He had lost a wife, a version of his future, and a story he once believed would last forever. But he had not lost himself. And sometimes, that is the only victory that matters. What would you have done if you were in Caleb's place, stayed silent until the truth came out, or confronted them before they ever reached the courtroom? Share your thoughts, because stories like this remind us that betrayal may be loud for a while, but truth has a way of finding the right room. And if you believe quiet strength deserves to be heard, make sure you subscribe so you do not miss the next story.